I'm back. Mr. Clark's back. Time to take a look at 12.7, the Roaring Twenties. Again, as we go through, you're just going to make sure that you're getting down good responses. Make sure you're putting in a good effort in terms of focusing in on each question, trying to determine what you might want to respond to before I share out some responses so you kind of get the best understanding of the topic as possible. So some of the key objectives as we move into 12.7. We'll describe how increased leisure time or leisure time and technological innovations led to a widespread shared pop culture during the 1920s. Of course, when you compare that to the 2020s, obviously pop culture is a lot easier to kind of embrace in contemporary society. But back then, obviously, with radio and newspaper really being the only mass media outlets for you, this was quite a bit more of a challenge to kind of keep up with pop culture during the 1920s opposed to today. Look at some of the changing roles of women during the 1920s, and we'll look at how the concept of modernism shown in artwork and literature reflected post-war disillusionment. Okay, question one, what is disposable income? Obviously, this would be something I would hope you have a good understanding of. And then we think about disposable income, how this kind of changed American culture during the 1920s. Now, when you budget in for your own self, maybe you have a part-time job, and disposable income is usually the money that you make that you can kind of spend, kind of your extra money, not things that are used, especially in a family structure, to pay the mortgage or a car payment or insurances, things like that. These are kind of your necessities: food, shelter, clothing. Disposable income, on the other hand, is the money that you can use to go out to dinner, to go on vacation, pay for entertainment, going to see a sporting event or a movie, whatever it might be. As Americans had more disposable income because of increased wages and more people working, they were willing to now spend it on many of the new nightlife options in many of the big cities in the country. For the 1920s, Americans had more time and money. Explain some of the causes and effects of having a little bit more disposable income. I kind of alluded to it a little bit already. During this period of time, and as we looked at previously, unions were gaining more power in the aftermath of World War I as they were now willing to stand up for better pay and shorter hours. And they kind of go hand in hand in terms of your disposable income. If you're working 12 or 14 hours a day, you don't have the time, the free time, even if you had the disposable income to engage in extra activities. But now with the shorter work hours, weekends off, things like that, and more pay in their pockets, people after World War I, because of the power of unions, now had the opportunity to go out and enjoy their lives. 3, why were silent films successful during the 1920s? Anytime you have something that's new within society, and silent films obviously were the very first films, and of course we prefer films with voices and action and music and things like that. But citizens initially were mesmerized by the simplest of technology, which was the very first motion picture films that you were able to see in the movie theaters. Silent films were perfect, especially too during this period of time. It was a transitional period of time in American history with a lot of immigrants coming into the country. So if you have a silent film, and regardless of where you are, a lot of our immigrants during this period of time are from different parts of Europe. So if you're from Italy and you only speak Italian, it doesn't really matter if you go to a silent film because you're just visually seeing the same thing that somebody who might be speaking English would see as well, and you're interpreting it for yourself. Of course, movies during this period of time too were very inexpensive, just a few cents to see a movie, which meant that just about anybody could scrape together a couple pennies to go see a movie. The medium that really developed during the 1920s was radio. And we'll take a look at the very first American radio station and how the radio impacted society. So as you probably learned back in 9th grade during the Industrial Revolution, you learned that the Italian inventor Marconi developed the very first radio. That's why if a radio program is the best program of the year and the awards that you can win for that is called a Marconi. Very similar to like an Emmy or Academy Award, something like that for some of the other mediums that you might be more used to today. The very first station was KDKA in Pittsburgh. You could still kind of pick that up even in New Jersey, even though it's out of Pittsburgh at night. It's 10:20 on the AM dial. Shortly after the development of KDKA in Pittsburgh, which still to this day broadcast, amongst other things, the Pittsburgh Pirates baseball games. 600 other radio stations would develop up over the course of the next several weeks, months, and years to come. And these radio stations broadcasted news, music, weather, entertainment, commercials. Commercials would be important too, especially during that period of time, as we had mentioned earlier. Getting information about new products and ideas a little bit more challenging in the 1920s. Many of whom relied on the radio broadcast to kind of get information about some of the new products and consumer goods that were available for individuals here in the 1920s. During the 1920s, a lot of famous Americans became very much admired in the household. Many Americans were obsessed with heroes like Babe Ruth and Charles Lindbergh. Why did both men appeal to Americans at that time? So hopefully you know who both of these individuals are. Maybe you can even speculate on your own as to why they might be heroes for many Americans at this point in time. And there's a couple of images there for you. Babe Ruth, of course, on the left. Charles Lindbergh on the right. Babe Ruth was the very first great baseball star. He's very unique, too, in that he was a great pitcher and a great hitter. He's very similar to a more contemporary Major League Baseball star, Shohei Ohtani, who can pitch and also hit. In fact, both were kind of superstars on both ends of the spectrum, both great pitchers and hitters. Eventually, Babe Ruth gave up pitching and only hit during the majority of his career. Ohtani has plans to continue to do both. So he was kind of an every guy, Babe Ruth, kind of an appearance, not necessarily what you would consider to be, especially in contemporary times, a prime-looking athlete. Somebody who enjoyed all aspects of life, eating, drinking. He loved hot dogs. Suppose he would eat 2 or 3 hot dogs per game during the game itself. And he became kind of a celebrity spokesperson for many of the new products during that period of time in history. Kind of like, Peyton Manning or some of these other stars, LeBron James, things that you might see in contemporary society on a lot of your different commercials, longtime sports athletes who were heroes and people who, they pay. Shaquille O'Neal's another one you see on commercials often, who are pro athletes and also make a good deal of revenue or money themselves by promoting products. And then Charles Lindbergh, he showed courage, and that's what was really admired by Americans, becoming the very first person to fly a transatlantic flight going across the Atlantic Ocean in May of 1927. And anytime you do the first, something like that, there was no guarantee he would make it alive from the East Coast of the United States to Europe. Let's give at least 2 examples of how technological innovations during the 1920s have become important in modern American life. So, of course, we mentioned radio communications, both for commercial purposes and then as we move on in time for military use, communicating amongst the battlefields, between different lines within different war fronts. Phonographs or a record player introduced personal music choice into the lives of Americans. And, of course, we've seen several developments in the contemporary periods of time in regard to music. We go from records to 8-track tapes, which you may not be familiar with, then cassette tapes, then compact discs. Then today, most people just stream their music directly on their electronic devices today. Women during this period of time, during the Victorian age or a more traditional period of time in history, how were women expected to live their lives? So you kind of reflect back to, like, say, the 1800s for women. Women were kind of the centers of the home and the family. The traditional wife had the role of wife, mother, keeping the home running smoothly. Women were thought to have good manners. Respect for their husbands was essential. Even prior to the right to vote for women, a lot of people unfairly contributed the right to vote for women to their husband. The husband would cast the vote for the entire household. So for those who wanted to keep things traditional and they wanted to kind of hold back the right to vote for women, they kind of felt like women indirectly got the vote from their husband, or if they weren't married, from their father or even their elder brother, things like that. For women, individual aspirations during the Victorian age, and that reflects back to Queen Victoria during that period of time in the 1800s, when she was the Queen of England, their aspirations were to be kept minimal. During this period of time, the 1920s, one group that developed that was really, indicative of the modern day woman were the flappers. They symbolized the young modern women who had hopes and dreams of their own. They were more liberated. They expected the same political and social rights as any man would have. They often wore shorter dresses, more makeup, enjoyed dancing, things that for a long period of time were thought to be scandalous. Number 9, what was the most important advance in women's rights in the 1920s? After gaining the right to vote, women felt emboldened to take on their next challenge. In 1925, the very first female state governors were elected. Governor Ross in Wyoming, Governor Ferguson in Texas. Women made strides in employment, gaining positions in journalism, aviation, banking, legal, and medical professions. Socially, women began to marry later on in life. They had fewer children. This opened up more time to pursue careers. Number 10, how did World War I impact literature and the arts? World War I altered how writers and artists viewed the world. Writers became a bit more pessimistic about society as they watched some of the horrors left over both of the war itself, World War I, as well as the pandemic. Artists, they experimented with more abstract styles. So we would see kind of a shift in the arts during the 1920s. Next, we'll take a look at an excerpt from The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. We'll read this little excerpt here. In the main hall, a bar with a real brass rail was set up and stocked with gin and liquor, cordials so long forgotten that most of his female guests were too young to know one from another. By 7 o'clock, the orchestra had arrived. No thin 5-piece affair, but a whole pitfall of trombones and saxophones, the whole 9 yards. People were not invited. They went there. They got into automobiles, which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. So based on an excerpt there, what point did Fitzgerald want to make through the descriptions of Gatsby and his parties? You can see a little image there. He points out the lavish nature of the parties, the impersonal nature of guests, people who just basically showed up, many of whom he did not know, and how people, in many ways, took advantage of Gatsby. And then the next little quote here is from Ernest Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms. I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice. I had seen nothing sacred, and the things that were glorious had no glory, and the sacrifices were like stockyards at Chicago if nothing was done with the meat except to bury it. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hallow were obscene besides the concrete names of villages, the number of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates. So 12 explained what Hemingway meant when he discussed the stockyards of Chicago. He was comparing that to the sacrifices made during the war, that there was nothing glorious about it. 13 explained 3 ways urban American life differed from rural American life during the 1920s. Urban America had much more entertainment, more cultural opportunities, where rural Americans lived a much simpler lifestyle with an emphasis more on family and church. Education was different as well. More formal education prioritized in urban America, where rural America put more emphasis on religion and practical skills to work on farms and things like that over like scientific theories. And lastly, as we always do, the lesson reflection, kind of thinking back on anything that we discussed. Lesson reflection, technological advancements transformed culture in the 1920s. What were the pros and cons of these technological advancements? Pros, more conveniences, additional entertainment options, positive impact on the economy. They link many faraway places together, allow for people too to kind of move outside the inner cities to kind of work in the city but live in the suburbs. Cons, that take away from more personal interactions. Something that's more technologically advanced today, like cell phones and internet usage, has also made people much more addicted to technology. and has had in some ways a negative impact on society. So that'll wrap things up for 12.7. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion here on the Roaring 1920s. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.